Hey guys, welcome to this next lecture where we're going to go over UV mapping. I'm going to show you how to do this with a simple object like this cube, and then we're going to prepare it for a custom texture that we're going to make in the next lecture. So we've got this basic scene here that we've started off with every time, and we're going to come in here and I'm just going to first kind of tweak some of these settings so we've got a nice foundational scene to play with when we get in here and start messing with our textures. So I'm going to do what I usually do, come in here with an area lamp for that studio lighting look. Change this to a nice big soft size. Samples up to something like 8. And let's bring this over here, sort of on this side. Bring it down and up. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and create another plane. Make it pretty big. And then bring it and set it right below the cube. So the cube's just sitting on it. Okay. Let's zoom in with our camera. And let's take a look and see how that looks before we start texturing. Okay, not bad. I'm going to bring this up a little bit in brightness so we can see a little bit better what we're doing. Let's try 0.2, and that's good. Okay, so we got a basic cube scene here again, and we're going to talk about UV mapping. So the first thing we have to do if we want to apply a custom painted map to this model is to tell Blender how we want our texture to appear on the model itself. And this is done by digitally cutting up our model on these edges and laying it out flat on a surface called a UV map. So once this is done, we can save that map on our hard drive and use it as a guide for painting and bring it into Photoshop to make our textures, and save that back out, pull it back into Blender, and then instead of using the UV map, we can use the new map that we painted, and it's going to kind of wrap it back around the model using that UV layout that we created to add custom textures in very specific places. So by using a UV layout, you know where all the edges are, which means you know if you want to go right up to an edge, you can avoid it, you can cross over an edge, you can do whatever you want, and you'll be able to do really custom textures that way. Now UV mapping can be done automatically, but you'll usually have to give Blender some help in order to get the results you need for a good readable UV map. So the first thing we're going to try to do with this cube is UV map it automatically. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and split the view here, and I'm going to change this view into a UV image editor. And what that's going to do is kind of give us a little window here. And right now it's showing the render, so I'm going to get rid of that. And let's change this to use a new window whenever we render, so it'll put it out there and not in our UV editor. Okay, so let's go ahead and try to unwrap this cube. I'm going to right click, go into edit mode, and if you go back over to the tools palette under shading and UVs, you've got your options for things you can do with shading, and then things you can do with UVs here, and then you've got your unwrap options, and some things we'll go over next with custom UV mapping. So first thing you can do is come in here and try to select some of these options to automatically unwrap your model. You can also alternatively do this with a keyboard shortcut in the viewport by hitting the U key on your keyboard. And if you just hit unwrap, what it's going to do is unwrap it, but it's going to put all the faces on top of each other in this this UV editor. So as you can see, it's tried to flatten out the cube, but it doesn't know how, so it's just stacked them all up. So to show you what this is going to do, I'm going to go ahead and create a new texture, and I'm going to do a UV grid, and just call it grid, and then hit OK. And this is the exact same thing you would be doing over here in the textures panel, just using this menu to do it. And as you can see in the background, it's created these black and white checkers with these cross symbols on the checkers. And this is going to let us kind of see what's happening when we test how the UV map looks. So in order to get this to show up, if I just render this now, you're not going to see anything different. It's just going to be this regular cube example. To get this to show up, we actually have to do what I was talking about in the last lecture, which is come over to this texture panel. And first thing we got to do is make sure that this has a material, which it does. And then we can go over to the texture panel and pull up type being image, because we made an image over here that we're going to use. Go down to image, and instead of opening one like we did for procedural, we're going to do a drop down here on the left and pull up that grid texture that we just made. The last thing we got to do in here is go down to coordinates, and instead of generated, now we're going to use the UVs because we created some UVs. And under map, it's going to use the default map for the UVs we created, which was UV map. And that's all you got to do. So it's set to color, should map this to the cube, we render it, and there you have it. So with it unwrapped, you can kind of see what's going on. It looks okay on the cube, and they're all stacked up, but you're going to realize when we get in here and do custom textures that if you had all the faces stacked up like this, that you're going to paint one thing and it's going to be the same on every single face here, because you've got all the textures on top of each other with those faces. So to kind of demonstrate this better, what I'm actually going to do is create another texture over here. And instead of doing a UV grid, I'm going to do a color grid. And let's generate that. So as you can see here, we've got another grid that's got some colors on it, some numbers. And let's come over here and switch our grid to the color grid we just made. And now we render it. And now you can see kind of a better example of what I mean. You've got the same image applied exactly the same over the entire cube. And maybe what you want, but again, if you're doing a custom map with different sides for this cube, you're going to want to be able to control what each side looks like. So to do that, we're going to have to figure out a way to have these not stacked on top of each other. So let's try hitting U again. Instead of going to unwrap, let's do something like cube projection. Okay, and that's better. It's got 3 of the sides showing with the other sides under this side. And if we render now, you're going to get a little bit different result. But still not the effect we're going for. We need to have these separate. So one of the other things you can do is use, let's try Smart UV Project. It's got some settings in here for angles you can use for trying to automatically map these, and you can tweak those, but we'll just leave it the way it is at 66. Hit OK. Now this is going to work because now I've got all 6 sides of the cube. So if we render this, now we're seeing a different sort of texturing on all the sides, and you can see it covers the seams because they're connected, which is good. We're going to get a nice uniform material that's going across these seams. But the problem here is you can see it's distorting a little bit. It's a little stretched because we're not getting those sides that come over the way they would normally be on the cube. The cube has squares, and as you can see, all the UVs here are rectangles. So we could take all the UVs here and scale them in a little bit to where we're back to squares, and that would work. We re-render this. Now that distortion's gone, and it works. But again, you got some seams here that aren't matching up, things like that, and it again could be kind of a headache if you're trying to get this edge and this edge to seamlessly go into one another. So let's go over some other options. Okay, so now that we know that our automatic options are going to kind of be a little tricky to use for this cube, let's do the same thing, but we're going to manually tell Blender how to unwrap our mesh by using what are called seams. So we're going to select edges where we want Blender to cut and separate our mesh, and we're going to mark those edges as seams. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go into the view here in edit mode. I went to edge mode down here. And I've still got my menu up here with the UV, so you can see this mark seam and clear seam option. And what that's going to let me do is right click on an edge, select it, mark it as a seam, and as you can see, if I unselect it, it's got this red color, which depicts it as an edge that has a seam on it. And so what we can do is select all the edges we want to cut and separate the mesh at with these seams, and it's going to tell Blender how to cut this thing up. So I want to cut along all these edges so it can unfold, and then I'm going to cut along this edge here and allow this flap to unfold and go up, and then we're going to let this flap unfold here. And the last thing we're going to do so this isn't stretched is cut this here on this edge so this can unfold. So this bottom flap's going to come up to the right and unfold to lay flat here. This left flap is going to lay flat here. Front flap is going to come straight up and lay flat here. And then this top flap is going to do the same and lay flat here. So you should have the middle part staying where it is and all the other edges laying flat around it. So if we select all of this now, we've still got our old UV map. If we now just click the U menu, and then we don't have to do anything other than go to just the straight unwrap, you're going to see the UV map come in based on those seams that we cut. And as you can see, it's not exactly what we were hoping for. It's come in and you've got some of what I was talking about happening with the unfolds. But we've obviously missed an edge somewhere because we've got this distortion happening here. So what we need to do is go around the model and figure out where we need to cut so that that distortion isn't happening. And as we can see, this edge here is the edge that isn't being separated from the side. So if we add another seam and then we unwrap it again, now we've got this cross pattern happening. And the good thing about this is all of our squares are proportional, they're all the same size. We've got a nice even flow happening with our object where we're only really going to have seams on the edges for the box, which on a box aren't that big of a deal on these edges. On the top edge, we're going to actually get a nice transition all the way across from one part of the box lid to the next. So if you wanted to, you could turn this box to where the seams are joining up and kind of hide that transition for the other parts, and it's not going to be that big of a deal. So now that we've got this in place, if we render this again, you're going to see a much nicer representation of this UV map. And this is a pretty simple example, but as you can see, it's really affected the quality of the texture map that we're able to apply here, because now we know the UV map works. We can export it, paint something else to go on top of this map in place of these edges and where they're located on the map, import that, and we'll have something completely custom in here. So I wanted to mention, for simple objects, this isn't difficult to grasp. I know a cube is pretty simple. But when you get to a point where you're trying to unwrap more complex models, such as people, then this process becomes quite a bit more difficult and tedious. So it is possible to use the UV tools within Blender, but if you're someone who's trying to do this quite often, you might consider looking into a software solution that's a little more dedicated to making this complex task easier, and I'm just talking about for the UV mapping part. So a great program for this is called UV Layout. I've used it in the past when I had a really complex object I had to unwrap, and it's really handy. So if you go to uvlayout.com, which is this website here, it's going to pull up their main site. And if you go to the gallery, you can kind of see what I'm talking about when I'm talking about more complex meshes. As we go through some of the examples here, you can see when you're trying to unwrap an organic object like a human or an animal, then you're going to have a lot more pieces. The transitions from one piece to the next, where they have to be seamless, is going to be a lot more complex. So something to be aware of. And to prevent stretching and all the things that are involved when you're texturing an object that's complicated, it's really going to be handy to have software that eases that process as much as possible. So I would recommend you guys get in here and go to the gallery. Definitely check out some of these nice UV layouts for the examples that they have on the site. And when it comes to figuring out how to unwrap more complicated things like meshes for humans, there's the easier you can make it for yourself, the better it's going to be. So that's what I would recommend. Now, in the next lecture, I'm going to show you how to apply a custom texture to the model that we've UV mapped here, and we're going to paint a texture up, and then I'm going to bring it back in and throw it on the model so you guys can see what that looks like. So I will see you in the next lecture.